Good morning, and thank you for having me in Le Havre today. I was taking the train this morning from Paris, and it was an incredibly inspiring train ride. The train was full of young people talking on and on about the positive economy and the LH Forum today. And it was quite exciting to hear that, and it made me start to reflect a bit on what allows people to have purpose in their individual lives. And it made me reflect on an experience that I was lucky enough to have in France 27 years ago. You're lucky in life if you find one or two mentors who help you find a sense of purpose. And 27 years ago, as a high school student, I came to Paris as an exchange student and lived with a French family. And unlike maybe some exchange programs, this turned out to be a lifelong conversation with my French father. He was a fighter pilot in the French Air Force, and his name was Roger Mathieu, and he had this incredibly deep ethical sense of purpose. For him, service meant helping to build a great society in France and advancing the ideals of France, of liberty and equality and fraternity around the world. And it's only in this most recent generation that young people find that they have an opportunity to serve not just through government or not just through the NGO sector, but that there's an opportunity to serve through business that has a greater purpose than simply making profits. And I'm incredibly grateful for that early formative experience of meeting Roger. Actually, last summer, I was able to bring my two young sons to Paris to meet their French grandfather. It was a very emotional experience. I recently had a conversation with another Frenchman, a journalist, to talk about what we do at B-Lab, the NGO that I'm one of the co-founders of. And this journalist, being an American, I was a little bit intimidated about speaking to a French journalist, very intellectual journalist, and so I went into a long discourse about Descartes and Rousseau and maybe even BHL and their views on a positive economy. And ironically, after just a minute or two, this journalist interrupted me. And he said, Mr. Kassoy, actually he said, Monsieur Kassoy, could you please just get to the point? As your American journalist would say, don't bury the lead. So the headline is that I'd like to talk to you about today is about a transformation that we see taking place in society all over the world. And that transformation is a systemic change, and it is the evolution of capitalism. It's the evolution of capitalism from a 20th century model of capitalism, which, as Jacques Attali just said, is all about maximizing shareholder value. That's the only objective. To a 21st century model, which is focused, whose objective is to maximize shared value, the value that's created for all of the stakeholders that a business affects. So Jacques Attali talked about Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was an American economist, and he famously had this line in the 1970s that the social responsibility of business is to make profits, to maximize profits for shareholders. And that's what happened with capitalism. It created incredible wealth for a few, but failed to create opportunity for many in the last 50 years. In that short-term effort to maximize wealth, incredible external costs were placed on society and on the environment that continue to have negative implications. Milton Friedman would be totally baffled by the transformation in the economy that's taking place right in front of our eyes. He would be totally baffled, I think, to see so many businesses who believe that they have a purpose beyond simply making profit, that they have a purpose to make wealth for to create wealth for all of their stakeholders. Now, this is the idea of an evolution of capitalism is sort of an audacious idea, even if it, in some ways, was the original idea of capitalism. And the question is, why now? Well, I think there are several reasons that are worth talking about. The first is that the institutions that we have traditionally looked to address all of our greatest challenges, while incredibly important, simply can't take care of the task on their own. Government budgets, we all know, are incredibly constrained. The NGO sector has a challenge in attracting capital and talent to scale. And so we need other answers. The second reason is that whether we like it or don't like it, business has become the most powerful force on the planet. It dominates almost every sector of our lives. In most countries, business is the largest proportion of GDP. And so business can either be part of the problem, and we saw that in 2008, or business can be part of the solution. And our view is that we must harness the power of business to solve our greatest social and environmental problems. The great news is that this is already happening. So in the US, where I come from, there is already a tremendous market that has developed in the positive economy. All of the important components of a marketplace exist. There are 60 million consumers who say they want to make their purchasing decisions from companies who reflect their values. There's over $2.5 trillion of investment capital, which invests through a values lens, meaning that there's something at work in their investment decisions other than simply profit. And maybe most importantly, there are more than 100,000 businesses in the US who self-identify as having a purpose beyond profit in their businesses. The numbers globally can only be dramatically higher. The challenge is to accelerate that transformation of the economy, to create more of those businesses, because these businesses, unlike traditional businesses, are actually creating value for all of their stakeholders. Now, make no mistake, these businesses are for profit. This is not about the NGO sector. What I'm talking about is for-profit businesses, and these are businesses that are highly competitive, but they're competing not just to be, like in the 20th century, best in the world, they're competing to be best for the world. We call those businesses B corporations. Certified B corporations, the B stands for the benefit, at least in English, that's created for all of society through these businesses. And the B helps us tell the difference between good companies and just good marketing. And this has become incredibly important because with a big market of consumers and investors who care about the impact that businesses are having, there is a tremendous tide of greenwashing. You can't open a magazine without finding an ad for any company, it doesn't matter what they do, that has windmills and solar panels and lots of green. And so this is what helps you tell the difference between a good company and just that good marketing. B corporations have a great deal of substance and rigor to them. So in order to be a B corporation, a company has to meet a higher standard of social and environmental impact, transparency, and accountability. They measure what matters, the impact of the business on all of its stakeholders. The second thing that B corporations do is they legally obligate themselves by changing their corporate articles to include language that requires them to consider when they're making decisions, requires them to consider the interests of their stakeholders. And that totally changes the conversation in the boardroom and in the office. We like to say that these B corporations and all of the stakeholders who are supporting them and the larger community of businesses who are just like them are leading a global movement. I won't even try to pronounce it in French, but it's a global movement to redefine success in business. Now, it's important to say that this community of B corporations is quite new, but they stand on the shoulders of giants who came before them, of 50 years of hard work in the microfinance industry, in community development finance, in the co-op movement here in Europe, in socially responsible investing. And so we look to all of those efforts before as inspiration. But the community of B corporations has really only been around for 5 years. And it started 5 years ago, just like any movement does, with a few brave souls who stood up, 13 entrepreneurs who stood up at a conference in California and said, "We're in. We're B corporations," without having any idea what they were in for or what a B corporation was. But that's what starts a movement. And over the 5 years since then, more and more companies have joined, and there are now over 600 B corporations all over the world. One of the things that gives us the greatest excitement and hope about the future is that this movement has become increasingly global. So while the early B corporations were all in the US, today we find B corporations across the developing world, from India to Kenya to Ghana to Nicaragua and Mexico and Chile and Brazil and Colombia. There are also B corporations in Germany and in the UK, and I hope soon that there will be B corporations in France. We tend to call them the rock stars of the new economy. We're Americans, what can I say? And let me just take 1 second to just tell you about a couple of these stories. Better World Books is a company, it's an online bookseller. But as they've grown rapidly, they've also been able to give millions of books away to children in the developing world, and they've been able to provide a large percentage of their profits to literacy programs. Sustainable Harvest is the largest importer of fair trade coffee in the United States. And as they've grown rapidly over the last few years, they've been able to increase the income of hundreds of thousands of farmers and farmer co-ops in the emerging markets. Revolution Foods makes healthy, locally produced school lunches in the US for children in many communities around the country who otherwise would have unhealthy food to eat. And as they've grown rapidly, again, they've been able to serve over 30 million healthy and locally produced foods, and in the process started to change local agricultural systems as well. The great thing about each of those stories is that there are only 3 stories, and there are 600 more just like them, and thousands of more coming, inspiring businesses who are changing the world through their businesses. The catch is that stories can't sustain a movement. Movements need institutions in order to sustain them over the long term, and make no mistake, this will be a very long-term movement to transform our economy. And so we at B-Lab spend a lot of our time working on much more boring stuff. There's no fancy pictures, there's no cool graphics to describe the hard work of creating rating systems to help channel capital to high-impact businesses, or to create a new corporate form called a benefit corporation that has higher standards of social and environmental impact. And speaking of standards, there are now 7,000 companies around the world that use the standards that we developed for B Corps for their own purposes to measure and improve their own impact. So we have a market and a movement, and we're starting to build the critical institutions that we need in order to transform capitalism, and all of those things come together, we believe, to create an historic opportunity to build a new sector of the economy. And if we get it right, it's a new sector of the economy that will provide economic opportunity for all, that will provide great places to work with meaning for everyone, that will restore the environment and rebuild local living economies, and maybe even that will alleviate poverty. There's only one other problem. Systems change takes a very long time. It will take a long time to transform an economy. And that brings up, I think, a great story about things that take a long time to build. There's a story about Cathedral Building, and it's a story that's very appropriate here in the greatest cathedral building country in the world. Many of the great cathedrals took centuries to build. It took, I think, nearly 200 years to build Notre Dame in Paris. And artisans would come from all over the world with their skills and their tools to help build these beautiful cathedrals. Most of them knew that they would never see the finished product of their work. Some of them might have had a vision of what it would look like when it was finished, but most of them just knew that they were contributing their individual skills to a collective effort to build something beautiful, something with meaning, something that would be lasting, something that would be permanent. They might have been poor, they might have had only one skill, but all of them knew that as individuals, they were change makers. The evolution of capitalism is a great story. It will only be a true story if all of us as individuals in each of the roles that we play in our lives are change makers in the same way. And we have great flexibility today in a way that those artisans never did. We can bring so many things to the table as individuals because all of us play roles as consumers, as investors, as workers, as entrepreneurs, as stewards of our environment, as members of our communities. And so in each of those roles, we have an incredible capacity to build this cathedral together. And to borrow a line from Gandhi, we must all be the change we seek in the world. Thank you.